This is Carrie Johnson with the Iowa Department of Management, and this is going to be a brief webinar to just provide some reminders and help familiarize city and county assessors with the online budget process for fiscal 22 in the Department of Management online system. First, I'm going to start out with just an overview of some general budget information, discussion of your tax levies that are available to you, general timelines, that sort of thing. Just a reminder of Department of Management's role. DOM provides the forms, which in this case includes web-based forms. We provide instructions, also technical assistance if you have questions, for all the local government budgets that submit property tax and submit budget to us. As far as information and access to our online system, you would always go to the Department of Management website. The address specific to assessors is dom.iowa.gov/assessors. We would call this your assessor resource page. It has links of various sorts to get you information that you might need, including a link to the online system. Another thing that it does list is previous year's tax rate documents. So if you were interested in seeing what historically had been tax rates in your county or another county, for instance, or you wanted to compare tax rates from your county to another county, you can pull up these documents. They are in an Excel format. So to start, we can review some of the different levies that are available to assessors in the state. And the main one is the Assessment Expense Fund. It has a 67.5-cent levy rate limit, and it's to finance the basic maintenance and operations of the assessor. So it's kind of your operations fund. It's where the majority of your action and financial transactions are going to come from. You also have FICA and IPERs available to you. There is no rate limit for FICA or IPERs. You levy the amount necessary. The assessment expense fund must be at its maximum. And you do not show expenditures in the FICA and IPERs funds. You would levy for the FICA and IPERs in those individual funds and then transfer to the fund with the salary expenditures, which in this case is assessment expense. There is an emergency levy available. It's for an emergency that cannot be financed through the Assessment Expense Fund, covered under Code of Iowa 24.6. We don't mean necessarily a natural disaster type emergency. What this means is you have an emergency need for property tax revenue that cannot be met through your Assessment Expense Fund. The levy rate limit for an emergency levy is 27 cents, and it does require approval of the State Appeal Board, and you must complete a special form. Basically, you would include it in your budget, and you'd file your budget with it to the county auditor like you would do normally by March 15th. And then you go to the State Appeal Board and say, okay, we're asking for this emergency levy. It's in our budget. Assuming that your public approved it, you can provide information on their feedback, and then discuss that need with the State Appeal Board, and they would have to sign off on the actual use and inclusion ultimately of that levy in your budget. Funds are also transferred from the emergency fund to the assessment expense fund to be spent. Unemployment levy has no rate limit. It is the amount necessary, and it's to pay for the cost of unemployment coverage. Either the unemployment premiums to be part of the state plan or paying unemployment claims to workforce development after the fact. Tort liability levy, again, no rate limit. It is the amount necessary. It's to pay for the cost of liability insurance, things like general liability, auto liability, your bonds, that sort of thing. Professional liability may also be used to pay for the payment of a judgment or settlement within the scope of Chapter 670. The budget deadline for the fiscal 22 budget is March 15th of 2021. It's a Monday this year. And keep in mind, too, that protesting a local government budget is a right of citizens. It is covered under Code of Iowa Section 2427. So people that are impacted by the budget or an expenditure or tax levy or by any item in the budget can appeal that budget by filing a petition. So essentially, they gather a number of signatures as determined by a percentage of folks that voted at the last governor's election. They file a petition, with some signatures with the county auditor. The county auditor would then review to make sure they had the right number of signatures and that signatures were complete, that sort of thing. And if so, they would then forward that document to the state appeal board. The deadline for a budget protest is March 25th, so essentially 10 days after your budget deadline. So the county auditor, upon receiving this budget protest, would take a look at the signatures and then just forward it on to the state appeal board. And I mentioned them already, but just to give you a little bit of background, the state appeal board is a 3-member body, including the director of Department of Management, the state treasurer, and the state auditor. And they would, upon receiving a budget protest document, they would schedule a hearing locally on that protest. So citizens could speak to it, the protesters could speak to it, the local government being protested could offer their rebuttal on, what's going on with the budget and what's under protest. The state appeal board typically sends out hearing officers to conduct that local hearing, who then would gather all that information from the hearing, bring it back to the state appeal board. The state appeal board would consider all the information and then render a decision on that protest, whether to uphold the budget or require changes to the budget, etc. And then to switch gears, budget amendments, you would amend, if needed, your current year budget, and the budget amendment is required for any increase in the totals for funds. So if you budgeted a certain amount in a fund and you find during that year that that is not going to be sufficient to meet the needs of your entity, then you would need to amend the budget, essentially go back to the public with a new public hearing, with a new notice, a new public hearing, and request the budget be amended for the current year. The amendment must be effective before any of the expenditure amounts are exceeded. Budget amendments do, as I mentioned, require the same notice and hearing procedures as required for that original budget adoption. Budget amendments are subject to protest. An amendment of a budget after May 31st, which is properly protested, but there's not enough time to hold that hearing process, is then void. So if you're getting to the end of the year and you're finding that you may need to amend, just sort of keep that in mind. You can amend at any time during that current year, but if you get too late in the year, so you're amending after May 31st and someone protests, well, there's probably not going to be a time to hold that local hearing and for the state appeal board to go through their process to render a decision before the end of the fiscal year. So in that case, your amendment would be void. So as I mentioned, just keep that in mind. The amendment form used to be this sort of one-page miscellaneous form that was generic in nature to many local government budgets, but now we have revised that process, and the form is found by logging into the same online system that you use to adopt your budget. Essentially, go back into the online system, navigate to that current year budget and select amend on that budget. Now, keep in mind, you're not actually going back and changing that budget document by amending, selecting amend on that current year budget. It's just going to generate a form that's going to be your amendment form for that budget. If you find you're going to need to amend your budget, I would just suggest at the time that you're going to be ready to do that amendment, there is a webinar on the amendment process, kind of similar in nature to this webinar, and it's viewable on that Assessor Resources page. So if you are getting close and you think, hey, I might need to amend my budget, what is the process again? I would suggest just going and reviewing that information. Once you begin a budget amendment too, there is a set of instructions just under an instructions button within that online amendment. So we'll take a little bit of time to review the budget timelines. The county auditor is going to certify valuations to you by January 1 of each year, and you develop your proposed budget by that time. The assessor, examining board, board of review, combine and file triplicates with the conference board chair. You, of course, publish your notice of public hearing and proposed budget summary not less than 10, no more than 20 days prior to the date of the hearing. You would hold your public hearing, and then following the public hearing, adopt that budget. And you'd certify that budget with the county auditor by March 15th. So that's your general time frame. We'll take a few moments now to review the online budget system. If you used the system last year, you'll find that it is very similar, has a similar feel, forms look the same as fiscal 21. Your login also should transfer. You should have the same access you did last year. Let me know if you have someone or if you need access to the system and you don't currently have it. You do have to have an Enterprise A&A account ID. If you don't have one of those, I can send you instructions on how to get that as well. When you're working in the system, if you use a tab key during data entry, it does move between the cells in which you can enter data. And you can also use the arrow keys side to side and up and down. As you move within a page, the cell that you are in will be highlighted and the row and column show a green highlight. That's just to help you sort of navigate through the form and find your place so you don't lose your place as you're working. And ending fund balances are produced by subtracting the sum of all expenditures from the sum of beginning balance plus revenue. Okay, so you're ready to go ahead and work in the budget. You go to that assessor resource page, dom.iowa.gov/assessors, and you would select the blue button entitled Submit and Amend Budget, because remember, you can also amend budgets in this system. On the home page, you would see the following. So this is going to show for you the status of valuations filing. So that way you know whether or not your county has actually filed the value, and if they have filed value, you'll see valuations populated in your budget forms. If they've not filed value yet, you will not see valuations. You can still do work in your budget forms, obviously. You can enter other revenues and expenditures, but of course you won't be able to complete the process until valuations are populated. So you'll see the blue box that you would use to enter the system, and you enter that Enterprise A&A account ID. And on the home screen over here on the left-hand side, you'll see budgets and reports. You would select budgets because you're going to be working in your budgets. And again, the system is going to show for you, if you just generally selected budgets, it's going to show for you the current year budget that you could amend or you could view, whatever the case may be. And also your fiscal year 22 budget that you're actually going to be inputting data into. So in order to enter into the budget, you would select Edit. Once you're inside the budget, you see tabs across the top representing the different funds and different pages that must be completed. Obviously, if you don't use FICA and IPERS, you're not levying for those, you don't have any fund balance in any of those, you may very well not be using any of these pages other than public hearing, budget summary, and assessment expense. But just keep in mind that those are all listed by fund for those funds that you use. You enter your revenue and expense detail on the supplementary detail pages, primarily, again, that assessment expense fund. And the data on supplementary detail pages is going to be totaled and brought forward to your summary and hearing tabs. So when you get to those fund tabs, you will find that within each fund, there's a tab for revenue data entry and expenditure data entry. So this is sort of what you'd see, revenues and expenditures. So you will need to hit both of those tabs within each fund to complete your data. Once your 2020 valuations are filed in your county, the 2020 valuation figures are going to populate into the adopted budget summary. So when your county is working in the system, as I mentioned on that home screen, they won't be filed yet. So they'll show under the valuations not filed column. And in addition, you will see that prior to valuations being filed, or if your county auditor finds that they need to go back in and make changes to values early on, you'll see this notice at the top of your screen that tells you that your data may change, the valuations are in unfiled status. So just be aware of that. If this is showing at the top of your screen, either the valuations may change because they're under, potential edit, or your county auditor simply hasn't filed your valuations yet. So this is your adopted budget summary, and once the value is listed, of course, in the budget summary, which the system will automatically do for you, once that value is listed, you can, in your column here, the AW column, enter in your tax dollar and replacement dollar request, and the system will then calculate your tax rate for you. Keep in mind, as you're working in the budget forms, blue cells are those you can enter into. White cells are either pulling from another source, or they're a calculated field. So again, this is looking at your tax request. You can see in this example, they are levying for the assessment expense fund at the maximum, and so then they can levy for FICA and IPERS. So they're levying $500,000 in property tax and utility replacement tax for FICA, for each FICA and IPERS. And then this information is going to pull over to the assessment expense fund page and to the FICA and IPERS page. Those levies will pull over for you. So the page that you'll be entering most of your expenditures in, of course, is assessment expense, and that might be a good place to start. You can go ahead at any time once the forms are open and start entering your actual, because you do have to enter 3 years of data, so your actual fiscal 20 data, your re-estimated current year 21 data, and then, of course, you finish with what you're proposing for your fiscal 22 budget. So again, you have revenue and expenditure tabs. You work through the process of entering in all of your expenditures and then all of your revenues. The revenues on property tax and utility replacement tax for the budget year will pull over for you. So in this case, we're going to work through an example of levying for FICA and IPERS and kind of how that works in the forms. It's just one of those questions I get. So you're levying at the maximum for assessment expense, and you need to also levy for FICA and IPERS because you don't have enough revenue to cover those expenses in this example. So what we show here is that, okay, well, in this particular county, we have to pay out $500,000 for, in this case, IPERS and maybe FICA as well. So we have to pay out, we know, $500,000 for that particular employee benefit. So that's our expense we need to cover. But we're saying, okay, but the expense fund itself is not going to generate enough property tax for that. So we have to levy for the FICA and IPERS. But in order to pay out the amount, it's actually paid out of assessment expense. So we're going to start at the end and kind of work our way backwards. So we're showing that the $500,000 is paid out of assessment expense. So how does it get there? Well, it is transferred in from, in this case, we're showing both FICA and IPERS fund, right? So over on the assessment expense fund under revenue, we're going to show that in order to pay that $500,000 cost on our expenditure side, we have to show that we're transferring it in from FICA and IPERS. So these are blue cells again, so we enter that information. And this is our FICA fund, right? So we're showing that we requested $500,000 total, which is our utility replacement tax plus our property tax levy. We requested $500,000 in property tax dollars in FICA. So we're showing that as a revenue to the FICA fund. But then again, on our assessment expense fund, we showed that we had to transfer in $500,000 from the FICA fund into the assessment expense fund because we showed $500,000 coming into assessment expense. The form is then going to show the $500,000 coming out of FICA to balance that transfer out for you. So that's just sort of how we got there, I guess. And when you look at the FICA and IPERS funds, levying for those, getting the money into assessment expense, and then spending it out of assessment expense. Another question that I get often is regarding designated fund balance usage. Sometimes folks use the designated fund balance as a way to save up for projects that are long-term or that are coming a few years down the road that they want to save up money for, and they want to be able to show that. So in this case, we have that we know we're going to save for 2 years and expend in the third year $100,000 for a large reappraisal project. Maybe it's the first year payment or whatever. So we're going to be saving $50,000 for 2 years, and then in the third year we're going to pay out that $100,000 as an expenditure. So basically what we need to show then is that of our fund balance at the end of the first year, we're going to set aside $50,000 of it for our designated project. So we need to put on line 36 that, okay, we know we have this much fund balance at the end of the year, but it's not all just available for anything. We're setting aside $50,000 of it for a future project. So year one, $50,000 of our fund balance is for a future project. Year two, we're saving an additional $50,000 to the $50,000 we already have. So we're saying, okay, well, at the end of year two of my fund balance, $100,000 of that is saved for this project that I'm going to pay out next year. So $50,000 each year, our designated fund balance is growing. And then in the third year, when we're actually writing that check, making that payment, that's our $100,000 coming out. If you have any questions regarding sort of that process, let me know and I can walk through the specifics with you individually. So once you're in the budget, keep in mind that you can check errors, you can save, and you can print at any time. You can print the full budget at any time. Once you have proposed your budget for publication, you have that hearing notice, you also have the option to just go in and print off that hearing notice. When you're in Chrome, you can select your local printer or do a save to PDF as your destination. So you can print a hard copy, or else you can save off a PDF version of your budget or your hearing notice to your machine for future use. If you want to include electronic virtual meeting information on your notice, there is a text box on the bottom of the public hearing tab to add some additional information if you would so choose. There is quite a bit of field available to you up in the meeting location. If you have electronic meeting information you want to stick there, it's pretty big. But if you run into a situation where you just have a lot of information for a virtual meeting, you can stick it below here too on this just optional space that you have available to you. Of course, before completing the budget, you're going to need to check errors. You cannot publish or propose a budget that has errors. So you want to check your errors and make sure you don't have any. Once you have no errors, the system is going to tell you, congratulations, no errors found, and you can proceed to obtain the budget hearing notice that you're going to publish. So when you're ready to do that, you go up to propose publish, you get the screen to enter the time, date, and place for your hearing notice. Again, there is quite a bit of space here in the meeting location if you want to try to enter electronic meeting information there. But if you don't think you're going to have enough space, you do have that optional text box. The system then generates a notice. As I said, you can print, you can save off to your system, and you can access it at any time after you have proposed your budget by going to that print at the top right. Following your public hearing, the board can make any allowable revisions, which includes decreasing tax asking or expenditures. You cannot increase from what you publish. But if they would choose to decrease from what you publish, that is an option available to them. And you would go back to your budget and return to draft, which essentially just opens up that budget for making changes. Make your changes, save again, and you would need to propose publish again. Now, if they're decreasing, you're not going to need to publish in your newspaper again. So you leave in that original publication date and hearing date. If you, for some reason, had to rehear, then of course you'd have to propose publish and enter in a new hearing date. But then if, once the budget is adopted finally by your board, then you'd go in and you'd be ready to adopt it. If there's no revisions or you've made your revisions, you just click adopt to proceed with the budget as currently presented. You enter your adoption date and click adopt. And keep in mind, this is the date that you actually adopt the budget. It's not the date, it's not like 3 days later that you're in the system ready to adopt it. So you can just hard enter the actual adoption date here, whatever it may be. Then you select adopt. Okay, so with your county auditor, you need to make sure you file the following documentation. You need to provide the proof of publication for that regular budget notice, provide that document to them. And you also need to provide them with the signed adopted budget and supplementary pages. That adopted budget summary has a spot for signatures, so you make sure to sign that and provide them with that as well as your supplementary detail pages by March 15th. If you have any questions at all, please go ahead and let me know. Thank you so much.